In what's a pretty big trade, Kjaerbye has moved from Team Dignitas over to Astralis, so the number 2 Danish team to the number 1 Danish team, and cajunb is the player he's replacing in Astralis, and cajunb is doing a direct swap over to Team Dignitas. Now, this is a pretty blockbuster move within the Danish scene. It's also one that you could have potentially foreseen if you tried to figure things out. Like, I'll put a video up there. I actually did a video about making a Danish super team, and essentially I said, since Astralis have so many of the good players, start with the foundation of Astralis, and this was one of the first moves I suggested. In terms of removing a star player or someone who's a big fraggo and big presence within the team in that sense, I suggested remove Cajun, put Kjaerbye in. Now, let's break this move down overall. So cajunb being removed, first and foremost, before we look at who's replacing him, because I think you should look at both components of a transfer when this happens. So is it right to remove cajunb? Now, obviously to a degree, because he is a good player and a strong player and a player with pedigree and history, he's someone where you would have to say, in this particular context, because it's not that he's playing like a bad player and he's not a weak player, you can't just say in isolation it's right to remove cajunb. Like, if you didn't have a good enough player coming up, or a good enough player who can replace him, or someone who can do different aspects that you need in the game, it might not be correct to replace him. That's the key I want to make here, and emphasize that he is a good player and a player with a lot of skill. But in this particular case, it was the right move. Because if you're going to have to remove someone from the team, the 2 player I suggested in my video was Kerrigan from the in-game leader aspects. I felt like they didn't listen to him as much anymore, or he couldn't get across to people what he wanted, and Cajun in terms of a star player / a fragger. So I think it's the right move, and I think actually it's the right move overall now. Like, it's true that unfortunately cajunb's rep got a little bit soured by how last year ended, because when the team was very strong, it's not that he was a monster within the team. The best player was Device. What tended to happen when they were very strong was he was really good on Dust 2, he was really good on CT Dust 2 AWPing, and so he would have these huge individual maps where he'd go really big. And so as a luxury to me, the 2 best players were always Device and Dupree, and then so as a third plus player, a third star, and someone who has the potential to be very explosive, I always thought that was the value of cajunb. So he's going to come along, and either on Dust 2, which is a very specific map, which helped make TSM at the time, as Astralis were called, one of the best teams in the world, it either added to their map pool to make them very good, or having this third player who could also frag up there with some of the best players in the world meant that you had a lot of firepower on Astralis, then TSM, and that's one of the reasons why they were such a dangerous team overall. The problem is, he hasn't really been that Cajun to the same degree since sort of the autumn onwards, like particularly December, the very last month of last year, he had a really bad run of form where he was very poor at Fragbite Masters, and he was particularly poor also at ESAA Pro League, despite the fact that the team made the semis and had a close series against Fnatic. He was one of the main reasons they weren't able to win that series and why they weren't playing in the final of that tournament. So you have to look at it, and he is someone whose level did drop off. Now, he picked it up a bit. He had some tournaments where he got better again. He had some maps where he got better again. I think overall, his overall level did pick up again, and his just raw fragging got better, but I feel like he was less effective in 2016. Like, he died a lot more, it felt like, overall in the key games. He wasn't as effective, obviously, in terms of AWPing. In fact, they took the AWP out of his hand most cases, put it into Device's hands, and made Device the primary AWPer. Dust 2 became a problem map for the team, firstly because of Cajun's drop-off. That made their Dust 2 completely lose all of its power, because it was so much about him on CT side in that static meta playing their car with the AWP as CT. It made their map drop off, so it couldn't become their number 1 go-to map anymore on their strong map. They lost faith in the map itself because of his level, and their style did get counted and figured out, and people knew how to play against it. Even if it was still worked to a degree, people knew in general, the best teams, what to do against it to have a good chance of success. So all these factors made cajunb less significant, less impactful on Astralis and their success, in my opinion, and therefore, unfortunately, degraded some of his value as that incredibly great luxury as the third best player in that particular sense. Then you've got to look at the fact that he's someone with a history of being a rager. Now, maybe he's improved a little bit. The stories I heard still had issues in this particular sense. Now, I always want to point this out. This is one of the great things about the Astralis team, is the difference between a rager and a choker, or a rager and a tilter. Because for me, rager and tilter tend to be more similar together, and they're not the same as a choker. In general, I've found choking is like what happens when Device inexplicably will have a map where he just has 9 kills in a really important decisive game, and he's the main difference as to why you lose, and yet he's a fantastic player, and for the rest of the tournament might have been playing fantastically. So you look at it, you look at the opponent, you look at the moment, you look at the pressure, and you say that's what got to him. He choked. He was like, he couldn't, he was paralyzed, he couldn't make the moves he wanted to make, he couldn't play the same way. For me, a tilter and a rager, The reason they're more aligned is it's more like when this people get angry or when something happens in the game that sets them off emotionally, what happens with them is they tend to play in like a rage run in, like a blind fury. And there's a very rare type of rage slash choker, like for example, simple, where I've seen them actually play better at times and play more phenomenally and almost like fuck the world, it's just them, and it actually channels them. Unfortunately for me, cajunb was more of a rager slash tilter in as much as it would make him play worse, but it wasn't the idea that he was choking and he was scared and he wouldn't take the opportunities. It's that he was so angry with his teammates and what they're not doing that would get on him, and then that would make him tilt more, and then he'd play even worse and take bad chances, actually take opportunities that don't make sense or play a very silly way on CT side, and that would cost him the game in that particular sense, or his individual performance in the sum of the total game. So there's also that aspect that when he's not as valuable to the team, that added into it is also always going to be a negative. And looking at a team environment, it's not going to be as healthy a team environment. You have to be winning for those people usually to be overlooked for the negative aspects they bring to the culture and the team environment and people's emotional state, because you're going to have an effect on your teammates in that particular sense. So a lot of the problems with rages and tilters is they if they're verbal about it, they can bring other teammates down, or even just the vibe brings teammates down without, oh, he's gone off on one, like, this is all just fucked at this point in time. So yeah, that's one of the big issues I see there. Now, in terms of him going over to Dignitas, I think this is great. This is a fantastic move. This is another reason why I wanted cajunb to win them as removed. Because I think if cajunb goes over to Dignitas and plays in the second best Danish team, as he did in the past when he left Copenhagen Wolves for a while, and then when he left Copenhagen Wolves also was removed and he was over in the team that at the time was N Faculty, and he like single-handedly won a LAN against the team that became Dignitas from Copenhagen Wolves, now TSM Astralis. This guy can be a monster if you put him as the star player of the second best Danish team. Put him in Kjaerbye's spot, build the game around him, make the game around making cajunb go off and win these games for us, and he will be better than he was in Astralis. He can be a star player. He can be one of the best players in the world, potentially a top 20 player, top 15, top 10 player maybe if he went really ham, playing in Dignitas if they build the game around him. And if he embraces this aspect of, it's not over my career, I can show him a phenomenal player. In fact, I can build Dignitas up to be a threat to Astralis, and then maybe someone else leaves Astralis, they come to our team, and now we start to become the best Danish team. We start to become a legit threat in the world. He can do this. He's capable of it. It's all about his mindset and Dignitas' mindset. So I think he can and should become a monster in this team. He should be like what Azio was at the end of his time in Dignitas, what Kjaerbye was earlier in the year in Dignitas. He can be a monster in all these ways, but you know what? He can be more than those guys, because those guys were phenomenal riflers and they were carries and they were doing very well in games that Dignitas lost. The difference is with Cajun, he brings AWPing as well. Now he's not like a straight up pure AWP style player. He's a player who's more like, he's going to use the AWP like 25% of the time on the right map, on the right side, often on CT side. That's when you need to give him the AWP, put him to work, but don't make him do it all the time. The reason why this is significant though is because one of the problems Dignitas had was AWPing. Like you saw, they had MSL using the AWP a lot of the time. They had other players using it every now and then, but MSL isn't a great AWPer. You can only use it in a very utilitarian manner, in a very like just utility manner, just stand in a spot, get information, hold one very simple angle. cajunb can dominate with it all on the right map, on the right side. So you put him in his hands. Now he can be more versatile to a degree than someone like Kjaerbye. It's not going to necessarily be as good with rifles as Kjaerbye, but he's still going to be a strong fragger also. And he can also bring as much fragging as Kjaerbye can. Now Kjaerbye overall I think is a better fragger, but in Dignitas, if you build the game around him, add in the AWPing, and I think in terms of pure impact, to some degree, he can be better than Kjaerbye was. He also brings a lot of experience, a lot of pedigree, and as I say, he doesn't choke. He tilts, he rages, yes, but hopefully that's not as big an issue. It's not as bad as choking, I don't think, that issue. It can be worked on a lot more. Now, moving on to the Kjaerbye side of things. Kjaerbye coming in, to me, makes a lot of sense, because this is a guy who in 2015, yeah, he was always a guy who seemed to choke, and he was underwhelming on LAN, and he never was living up to the skills of what everyone said he has and what he had in the online games and against low-level opponents and in the odd group stage game. But he became a monster early this year. At DreamHack Leipzig and ESL Barcelona, this guy was fucking unreal. He was one of the best players at those tournaments, despite the fact, yeah, his team didn't win either of those tournaments. They obviously made like top 4 at Leipzig. They had like an okay finish at Barcelona. What's funny is the tournament that they went to the final of was Game Show, Global Esports Cup. And at that tournament, he actually had a pretty weak tournament there, even though they made it to top 2. Copenhagen Games, yes, he had a very poor result, but the whole team was terrible there. I thought he picked it up a lot at Malmo. He was good again there. His fragging especially was very good. He had a very high impact. decent enough at Gfinity, but considering it was lower levels opponents, yeah, did have a bit of a wandering performance. But overall, very solid 2016 so far. Has been one of the better players from teams outside of the top 5. Certainly warranted being the number 1 candidate to get this spot and get this chance at coming into Astralis. And I think him coming in now makes a lot of sense. I mean, he comes in fresh off the EU minor, low-level teams, but he fucking destroyed them. He absolutely stomped the fuck out those low-level opponents, like he should have done, like he should have done to some of the teams at Gfinity, to be fair. So he comes in very hot, and he's a player where what's great about him, one of the really good things he's going to add to Astralis, I think, is that he has shown in 2016 he's gotten over the choking issue. He's been very good under pressure. Like at DreamHack Malmö, his team completely abandoned him against Envious in the round of 8. They should have been favoured to win that series. They should have been competitive in that series. You should have won a map in that series. They did none of that. Envious shit all over them, wrecked them completely, had like a throwback performance. Kenny S was going ham. And what was the main thing that kept them in the game in terms of dignitas? It was Kjaerbye. Kjaerbye played like an absolute man in that series when everyone else abandoned him. So that's great, because one of the problems they've had in dignitas, in TSM, now Astralis, was choking. Now, the two people who choked the most, Device mainly, but then it's also been Dupree to some degree. Now, as I said, KGB wasn't a choker, but he was a rager and a tilter. So as they're choking, he's raging and tilting. So there's no counterbalance there. I feel like bringing Kjaerbye in, he's going to, again, in theory, he's going to slot into that like 3rd star spot, depending on how Dupree does, the 2nd star behind Device. What's going to be great about this guy is he's going to come into this equation, and in theory, he might be better under pressure. He might be able to step up when those guys have their issues there, not just tilt and rage along with their choking. And now that Device has gotten over some of his choking issues, he's had a pretty good performance at DreamHack Malmö in the decider against Nip, had a pretty good performance overall in, well, obviously his last tournament, ESL Pro League Season 3 finals. I think overall, now you add in Kjaerbye, now you can really cook them with gas. This is a team that, this might be the move that can help take Astralis back to actually contending and maybe winning titles. So I think this is the great move. Also, he doesn't come in with any AWPing implications. There's not going to be that question of do we give the AWP back to cajunb. I think they should still not use Device for it all the time. I think him and Carrigan should split the responsibilities, but I think Kjaerbye comes in as a very solid rifler, and this should be pretty good overall. I also think you look at how they fit within the system. In theory, you want Device more towards the back end of the rounds. You want Dupree going in more overall. You want Kjaerbye somewhere in the middle. I think this makes sense even in terms of how his role and his responsibility would be on the T side even. I think as a 3rd fragger, he can be one of the best 3rd fraggers in the world. If you look at all the setups of all the teams in the world, he can be strong in that particular sense. And so I think this is a good move for everyone. Kjaerbye and his career, Astralis and their careers, cajunb in his career, relative to how good he was in Astralis, cajunb and dignitas. I think this can help everyone. This can be good for everyone. Now, going forwards, unfortunately, they can't use Kjaerbye at ESL 1 Cologne. So they've essentially had to give up probably the chance to win that major. They can't use him due to the way Valve set up the minor and the qualifier system. Because if you remember, this is what happened to Kusta and Team Liquid. Before the qualifier, they signed Kusta and they wanted to use Kusta in the qualifier at the major. Valve said you can't. Mainly because he had helped NME, then changed to Selfless, qualify for the major qualifier. And so he has to play there. And he had to play with them there. They didn't qualify. And then Liquid went to the major, but they couldn't use him. He'd already tried to qualify with someone else. Now, part of the reason they don't want to allow you to swap is they don't want scenarios like this to happen, where Dignitas qualifies, and then you just steal their best player, and then they're fucked completely, and then they are a joke at the qualifier. And also, if you think about it, in a weird way, that sort of fucks over everyone else who was just at the minor, right? Because then the teams at the minor who didn't qualify are like, well, I only got beat up by the Kjaerbye guy, and he's not in Dignitas now, and therefore they're not going to have a chance to qualify. It should be my spot. You know, I can understand that logic. I don't necessarily like it. I think there should be a different system in place as to how you can make this work, especially because this particular case is very different from that. It's not just poaching the best player. You're actually giving them back something of pretty equal value in terms of the value to both teams overall. So I think there should be some sort of concession that can be made in that sort of a scenario, but they can't in this particular situation, and I can't contact Valve directly to talk about it beyond sending them an email and hoping they do something. So that means that in terms of the guys from Astralis, because remember, they're already qualified for the next major, they're not going to play there. It's not like Team Liquid's situation entirely. They're going to have to use a stand-in at the major itself. And interestingly, I think it said something, let me double check here. I think it said that they would actually, cajunb though could help Dignitas at the qualifier or something along those lines. Let me double check, because I don't want to be wrong with this. I want to just see if I've got the information somewhere. So let's have a look. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, it's implied in the post that he will help them. cajunb can help them at the major qualifier. Now, by the way, that's a context I should mention in itself. I think that actually, yes, Dignitas, I already thought, had a very good chance to qualify for the major. I think they will qualify for the major. I think this is the right team to do so. cajunb is definitely a good enough player to be one of the best players at that qualifier. I think they should qualify overall. So moving beyond that, there's another issue because of the Astralis issue. Because remember, Astralis is not an organization like normal organizations. It's an organization owned by the 5 players that formed Astralis. So here's some interesting parts for you. He obviously owned part of Astralis. He owned a percentage of it. Now, presumably, this means the solution is for him to be bought out of that overall. Because it would be a bit weird if he had the conflict of interest of him having a controlling interest in Astralis, playing for a rival of Astralis. So presumably, they have to compensate him for what would have been his cut. Now, interestingly, people don't know this, but because it was only when you founded the team you got the equity, the Kjaerbye joining will not be getting any equity. He joins as a player, and essentially the other teammates are his boss in a weird way, or at least they own the stake of the company that he plays for. So when they did an AMA, when they first announced the team, people asked what would happen in a case of a roster move with one of the co-owners leaving. And he said that there are some restrictions in terms of people being co-owners of the company, and that the change, it's how the change is made that has an impact on their shares. So, for example, if they got banned for back banned, all the rest of it, then they could terminate his contract, they could take it out, all the rest of it. If a player is cut from the roster due to bad performance or other game-related issues, the player will have 3 months full salary and then become a free agent. He will not lose his percentage in the company. He might want to stay in the company and work as an asset, etc. So here's another one, though. If a player chooses to leave for another offer / doesn't want to play anymore, there are some restrictions. It depends on the situation, but if a player stops and keeps a position in the company, it's not a problem in that regard. Does he choose to play for another team, then there is a conflict of interest. Now, here's the issue there in that particular scenario, is that presumably it's the last one. Even though he didn't really choose to leave, they're going to take it that he was cut, but since they've engineered this move and he's going to a Danish rival, it'll be counted in that last scenario there. So I imagine they will come up with a very reasonable scenario where maybe they pay him a couple of months' salary, maybe they buy him out in some particular sense, and that's what compensates him for having been known or having formed Astralis, and that's what will solve all of this issue. So you can see there's some extra process that has to take place because of the Astralis issue, but overall I think a very interesting move, and I think one that has exciting potential for both teams, but particularly Astralis. I think this could be the move. You know, sometimes you need a fresh look, you know, sometimes you need to change things up a little bit, out with the old, in with the new, you know, get a bit of youth involved in things to see if it works out better.